Lesson 43, the future active participle, the future active infinitive, the reflexive pronoun sui. Hi everybody, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're on page 129, and again that's lesson 43. And today's lecture is a special one because the teaching will be given by our special guest speaker, Michelle. And today Michelle is going to explain the future active participle and even how to form a future active infinitive with it by combining it with esse. So without any further ado, take it away, Michelle.
Hi, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. This is your guest lecturer, Michelle, and today I am going to talk to you about the future active participle and the future active infinitive, which are both very related. And I'm also going to talk about the reflexive pronoun sui, but that is less related to the other two concepts in this chapter. So if we look at section 346, it reads, the future active participle. The future active participle is formed by adding urus to the supine stem. Now, when you look at the dictionary entry for any Latin verb, remember there are going to usually be 4 words in the dictionary entry, something like amo, amare, amavi, amatum, or laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum. And each one of those parts is important for forming different versions of the verb. So the first and second principal parts are used for the present tenses, both active and passive. The third principal part is used for the perfect tenses, but just active. And the fourth principal part is sometimes called the supine, but it is also the perfect passive participle, and it is used to form perfect passive verbs. Now, one weird thing about the fourth principal part is, despite the fact that it is usually only used for passive forms of the verb, it is used to form one active thing, and that's the future active. So both the future active participle and the future active infinitive use the fourth principal part. So as section 346 says, in order to form the future active participle, all you have to do is replace the ending of the fourth principal part. So that's usually going to be us or um in the dictionary. So for example, laudatum or amatum, you're going to replace that ending with us. So our examples give us laudatum or laudatus, depending on what dictionary you're looking at, turns into laudaturus. Video, videre, vidi, visum turns into visurus. Rectum turns into recturus. Captum turns into capturus. Auditum turns into auditurus. And futurus is a little weird, so I'll get to that in a minute. But those are our examples in Latin that section 346 gives us. And unfortunately, we do not have an easy future active participle that's sort of 1 or 2 words in English. So the way we have to translate future active participles sounds a little clunky in English. We translate them as about to verb. So we see laudaturus is about to praise, visurus is about to see. So if you think about it logically, that phrase is acting like an adjective because we're talking about participles, and participles are verbal adjectives or verbs that act like adjectives. So if someone is laudaturus, that is an adjectival phrase that's describing them. They are about to praise. Or, for example, in English, we could say, the boy, comma, about to praise, comma, went to the temple. And the phrase about to praise is acting like an adjective. And so in Latin, we would use a future active participle. So if we go down the list of our future active participle examples, visurus comes from the verb to see, so visurus means about to see. Recturus comes from the verb that means to rule, so recturus means about to rule. capturus, about to take or seize, from capio, capere. Auditurus comes from audire, to hear, so that means about to hear. And then we get to our last example of a future active participle, and that is the one that we don't have to think about forming in Latin, because the future active participle actually is the fourth principal part for the verb to be. And the reason for this is because you can't have a passive form of to be. You can't be'd. So the principal parts of to be, sum, esse, fui, futurus, don't even allow for a passive form of that fourth principal part. The fourth principal part is only used in the one situation where any fourth principal parts are active, which is the future active participle and infinitive. So instead of having the verb be sum, esse, fui, futum, and then we can change it to be futurus for the future active participle, the future active participle just sits there as the fourth principal part. So, since futurus is the future active participle of the verb esse, to be, we translate it as about to be, just like all the other future active participles. Moving on to section 347, we have a section about the endings of participles. So this is just a review to remind us all the different participles we've learned. So now we have 4 different participles. We have the present active participle, which we use the second principal part to form. We usually chop off that re and then add ns. So if we were doing do as our example, because it asks us to do a couple examples at the end here. So starting with do, dare, dedi, datum, to give. Dare, chop off the re and add ns, becomes dans, which means giving. Now remember, participles are adjectives, so we need to be able to form different cases and numbers and genders of our adjectives. So the ns is the nominative singular, and that's the way I always think about it. Ns stands for nominative singular. And in order to form all of the other cases and numbers, we change the ns to an nt and then add third declension endings. So dans is nominative singular, dantis would be genitive singular, and so on and so forth. Next, we have the future active participle, which we just talked about. So we would take the fourth principal part, do, dare, dedi, datum, and replace that with urus. So that would become daturus, and that would mean about to give. Next, we have the future passive participle, which we go back to using the second principal part for. Again, we chop off that re and replace it here with ndus, and that us can change depending on the case, number, and gender of the noun that the adjective's describing. So it could end up with ndus or nda or ndum or any other first or second declension ending. So if we were using do, dare, we would take dare, chop off the re, and add ndus. So that would become dandus. And we usually translate the future passive participle as to be verbed with a sense of obligation. So do, dare becomes dandus, to be given. And finally, our perfect passive participle, we use the fourth principal part, and all we need to do really is change the fourth principal part endings based on what case number and gender our participle needs to be. So we don't really actually have to change the fourth principal part at all for it to be a perfect passive participle. Some books argue that in the dictionary, the fourth principal part is the supine rather than the perfect passive participles, but most modern Latin teachers teach the dictionary as having the perfect passive participle in the fourth principal part. So if we were doing it for dare, do, dare, deity, datum, or datus, and there's your perfect passive participle, datus. That means having been given, or sometimes just given, depending on the translation or what you're trying to say. So we can do this for our other examples as well. Eubeo, eubere would become eubens for the present active participle, and that means ordering, because we use the second principal part, eubere. And then the future active participle, we're going to use the fourth principal part, eubeo, eubere, eusi, eusum, replace that with urus, and that becomes usurus, and that means about to order. The future passive participle, again, uses the second principal part, so eubeo, eubere, and that becomes eubendus, to be ordered. And finally, the perfect passive participle is the fourth principal part, so eubeo, eubere, eusi, eusum. So eusum, or usus, usa, eusum, means having been ordered, or just ordered. Our next example is yakio, which means to throw. So yakio yakere is going to turn into yakiens in the present active participle. That means throwing. It's going to use the fourth principal part for the future active participle. Yakio yakere yaki yaktum becomes yakturus, which means about to throw. Then the future passive participle goes back to using the second principal part, and that will be yakiendus, which means to be thrown. And finally, the perfect passive participle uses or is the fourth principal part, yakio, yakere, yaki, yaktum, and that means having been thrown. The last example is the verb munio, munire, muniwi, munitum, which means to fortify. Let me go in a different order this time, and I will go through the ones first that use the second principal part and then use the fourth principal part. So using the second principal part, we're going to do the present active participle. So munio, munire turns into muniens. And muniens means fortifying. Then the next one that would use the second principal part would be the gerundive, or the future passive participle, and that would be muniendus, to be fortified. Then the other two use the fourth principal part. So the future active participle would change munitus to muniturus. That would mean about to fortify. And the perfect passive participle is just the fourth principal part, so that would just be munitus, having been fortified, or just fortified. Section 348 is about the future active infinitive. And in my opinion, this is one of the easier or more straightforward pieces of Latin grammar that there is to learn, because you have now already learned all of the pieces you need to form the future active infinitive. So the secret is that the future active infinitive is just the future active participle followed by the verb to be. So remember, an infinitive is translated as to verb. In my opinion, it sort of all comes together almost more simply than you would expect. So again, unfortunately, in English, we don't have an easy way to express the future active infinitive. We don't have a simple way of saying to do something in the future, other than literally saying out the phrase to do something in the future. So if you wanted to say in English, I want to go swimming tomorrow, that's the shortest way you can do that. There's no shortcut to say to verb in the future. But in Latin, it's a little simpler, and it takes a few fewer words to say. So that's a little bit of an explanation of why the translation of the future active infinitive is so awkward or so clunky, because we literally have to say to be about to verb, or to verb in the future. So remember, all you need to do to form the future active infinitive, as this says, the future active infinitive is formed by combining SA with the future participle. And by future participle, it means future active participle. They really should have clarified that because there is such thing as a future passive participle, but when they say future participle, they mean future active participle here. So, laudaturus esse is our first future active infinitive in this list, and it means to be about to praise. So the cool thing about this is you almost don't even need to learn this section to be able to translate this, because you know that esse means to be, and now you know that laudaturus means about to praise. So all you have to do is put them together. Laudaturus esse means to be about to praise. Visurus esse means to be about to see. Recturus esse means to be about to rule. Capturus esse means to be about to take. Auditurus esse means to be about to hear. And futurus esse, which is kind of funny, means to be about to be. Now, I want to point out that sometimes this can get a little confusing for students because it says the form is created by combining esse with the future participle, and I want to be really clear that it is always going to be two separate words. So we think of this as a sense unit or as a grammatical chunk. Laudaturus esse works together to be the future active infinitive, but it is two words. It's not one word combined or anything like that. Now, section 349 is reminding us that the future active infinitive is indeed made up of the infinitive esse and the future active participle of whatever verb you're using, which means that the participle is still going to behave like a participle. The ending is still going to change depending on the case, number, and gender of the subject. So section 349 says, when a subject of the future active infinitive is used, the participial form, urus a agrees with the subject in gender, number, and case. So I want to be about to praise. I might say, volo laudaturus esse. But we want to make sure that that participial ending agrees with the subject, so it depends on who I is. If I am a man, it would say volo laudaturus esse. If I am a woman, it would say volo laudatura esse. And if I were a neuter object, let's say a temple, and I was about to hear people praising in my building tomorrow, I would say, volo auditurum esse. I want to be about to hear. Then we have a couple examples in section 349. So number 1 reads, legatus dicit Caesarem milites laudaturum esse. Now, what this example reminds us is that most often in Latin, we don't even translate infinitives with the word to, because the most common use of the infinitive in Latin is an indirect statement. And so we can employ the future active infinitive in indirect statements. So legatus dicit means the lieutenant says, and then says is the type of verb that introduces an indirect statement. He says that Caesar, and we know Caesar is the subject because Caesarem is accusative, and the subject in an indirect statement is going to be accusative. So the lieutenant says that Caesar, and then we could translate this two different ways. Caesar laudaturum esse tells us it means to praise, it tells us it's future. So we could say Caesar will praise, or we could say Caesar is about to praise. Either of those are fine, but will sounds a little better, so that's why the translation in the book says will. And then our direct object, which is accusative, is milites. So altogether, it means the lieutenant says that Caesar will praise the soldiers, or that Caesar is about to praise the soldiers. Now, I will just point out that since the both subject and direct object in an indirect statement are accusative, we need to do a little bit more investigative work to figure out which one is the subject and which one is the direct object. But we can figure out that Caesar and not the soldiers are the subject because the participial ending of laudaturum is going to agree with the subject. And is singular. So if it were plural, then it would be the soldiers praising Caesar. But it's singular, so Caesar is the one about to praise the soldiers. Our second example, legatus dicit, again, the lieutenant says, followed by an indirect statement, that, and this is exactly what I was talking about. How do we figure out which one of these is the subject, milites or caesarem? Well, let's look at the participial ending of auditurus, which is part of our future active infinitive. Os is plural. That's accusative, plural, masculine, which means that our subject needs to be plural. So the lieutenant says that the soldiers will hear or are about to hear Caesar. Now, the next section, section 350, is something totally different. This is about the reflexive pronoun. So the reflexive pronoun is a type of pronoun that literally reflects. It reflects upon the subject. So section 351 actually explains what this is. So I'll do section 351a first. It says, sui, a personal pronoun of the third person, is called the reflexive pronoun because it refers to the subject of the principal verb for its meaning. So what this means is we only ever use the reflexive pronoun to refer back to the subject of the sentence. Now, because it is used to refer back to the subject, it's never going to be used as the subject, which means we don't have a nominative form, because that's the case you use for the subject. But we have forms for genitive, dative, and accusative, so the forms go sui, sibi, and say, and there's an alternate form for say that is say, which is just that word repeated. Now, the most tricky thing about the reflexive pronoun is that in English, we translate it as himself, herself, itself, or themselves. This can be tricky because we use that word, right, himself or herself, in a couple different ways in English. Now, I was having a little trouble figuring out whether you have learned the other way we end up translating as himself, herself, or itself yet. So if you haven't, then you're just going to learn something else new right now. So in Latin, we have two different words, and in English, we translate them the same, but they have different meanings. So the one that is not in this chapter is called the intensive pronoun. So it intensifies what you're saying. So an example might be, he himself is going to the store, or I myself will do the deed. So the word myself or himself is not doing anything other than intensifying who's doing the action or who that word describes. However, the reflexive pronoun is used in a totally different way in English, but it's the same word in English. So we might say something like, he hid himself, to say, he went and hid behind a chair. And the word himself there is not intensifying anything. It's clarifying what he hid, right? Did he hide a pencil, or did he hide a book, or did he hide himself? And in this situation, he hid himself. So that is a reflexive pronoun because it is reflecting the subject. And there are a lot of phrases in other languages that use reflective pronouns that English doesn't. So for example, I hid is a really common one. In a lot of other languages, you have to clarify what you hid. Whereas in English, we usually can just say, oh, I hid, and it makes sense that you're hiding yourself. So a better example in English might be to wash, because you always need to clarify who or what you're washing. You could say, I washed the dog, or you could say, I washed myself, or even I washed my hands. So if you have something like he washed himself, the word himself is the reflexive pronoun. It is referring back to the subject, which in fact is the thing that the subject is washing. So we have a couple examples here in section 351 in Latin. Milites se venturos esse dixerunt. Now this jumps right into using the reflexive pronoun in a pretty complicated situation, which is an indirect statement. But the cool thing this sentence does is incorporate all the different grammatical structures that we learned today. So, milites is their subject. It means the soldiers. And then our main verb is dixerunt. That means said. And then we have an indirect statement. They said that, and our subject is say. So say is accusative, because the subject of an indirect statement needs to be accusative, but it's referring back to the subject of the main sentence. It's reflexive. So the soldiers said that they, and then venturos esse is our future active infinitive, and that means about to come or will come. And in this sentence, it makes the most sense to say the soldiers said that they would come, because said that they will come sounds a little awkward. Now, the thing I think is the hardest to explain about this is that in English, the soldiers said that they would come does not actually clarify who they is. But in Latin, say clarifies that the quote-unquote they is the soldiers and not anybody else. So in Latin, if we wanted to say someone else is coming, the soldiers said that they, the farmers are coming, you would use the pronoun is ea id instead of the reflexive pronoun that refers back to the subject. So that actually is explained in the next paragraph. It says, if eum had been used instead of say, the soldiers would have meant that some other man would come. Compare this distinction with that between the possessive pronoun suus and the genitive eius, which you learned about in section 191. Now, the second example up here says miles dixit se venturum esse. So you might be noticing by now that there is no differentiation between singular and plural of the reflexive pronoun. So we need to use context clues to figure it out. Because remember, the reflexive pronoun always refers back to the subject. So all you need to do is ask yourself, is the subject singular or plural? Well, the reflexive pronoun will match that. So here, miles is singular. The soldier said that he will come or would come. And section B of 351 just clarifies what the difference between say and say is. It says the reduplicated form say is sometimes used for emphasis in the accusative and ablative. So sometimes you'll see say instead of just say because it is more exciting or more intense. Other times, there are other reasons for using say. So the most common reason in poetry might be to match the meter or to make sure the line fits with the meter. But in general, in this book, you'll probably see say as a regular reflexive pronoun and say as a sort of more intense version. And then just like with pronouns like me and te, secum is used instead of cum se. So if you wanted to say something like he was doing something with himself, which would sound a little awkward, but grammatically you could say that, you would say secum instead of cum se. And it clarifies that that's because cum is an enclitic, which is a suffix, basically. Just like que that you tack on at the end of a word to mean and. Section 352 is new vocabulary for this chapter. So our first word is a neuter noun, biennium, biennii, which means 2 years' time or 2 years. So if you break this word apart, the parts are bi or by, which means 2, and ennium comes from annus. So biennium is 2 years. Sui is our reflexive pronoun, meaning of himself, herself, itself, themselves. So it just gives us the genitive singular form, but it's assuming that we just read that whole chart that had all of the forms in it. And our next word is an adverb, praeterquam, which means except or besides. Then we have a couple new verbs in this lesson. So existimo, existimare, existimavi, existimatum is a first conjugation verb that means to believe or to think or to estimate. Be careful not to translate this one as to exist. That's not what it means in Latin. The next verb is comburo, which our book clarifies is a compound verb that is the combination of con, which usually means together, and uro, which means to burn. So this verb is a little bit more intense. It is not just to burn, it's to burn up, or maybe burn up completely, or to consume. So comburo is a third conjugation verb that goes comburo, comburere, combusi, combustum. And this is related to the English word combust, which has to do with burning up or catching on fire. The next new verb is recipio, recipere, recapi, recaptum, which you might notice looks pretty similar to copio, and that's because it's a compound verb of copio. So copio means to take or seize, and re is a prefix meaning back. So recipio means to take back, or it can also mean to receive. Now, it becomes recipio instead of recapio. That's sort of a linguistic feature because the vowel shortens in the middle of the word. So recipio, recipere, but then it goes back to the vowel you would expect, just like capio, capere, capi. It goes recipio, recipere, recapi, and then the E is different at the end, recaptum. And this verb also means something special when it is combined with the reflexive pronoun. So if you have se, or a form of se, with recipio, it means to retreat, to return, or to withdraw. And again, I think if you think about this logically, it makes sense. So literally, se recipio means I take myself back. So if you take yourself back, you are retreating. You are returning to somewhere you came from. Finally, we have another compound verb with capio, and this is sub plus capio, which turns into suscipio, suscipere, suscapi, suscaptum, and that is a third IO verb. And that means to take up. And again, it means something special with a reflexive pronoun. Now, this time it says with CB, which means it takes a dative, because CB is that dative form. So if you have the phrase CB suscipio, it means I take upon myself, or I undertake. So with the reflexive pronoun, it doesn't just mean take up, like pick something up or start something. It means to undertake it. Moving on to section 353, we have our translation section. So why don't you go ahead and turn off the recording and try to translate all of the sentences from Latin to English, and then you can turn the recording back on and I will go over them with you. Okay, hopefully you have completed your homework by now. So let's go over the exercises together, starting with number 1. Number 1 reads, Caesar duiciacum ad se vocari iubet. Caesar is the subject, that is the nominative singular form of the name Caesar. Our verb comes at the end, just like it does in many Latin sentences. Our verb is iubet, that is third person singular, present active indicative. So Caesar is our subject, and Caesar orders. Then our direct object is duiciacum, that's the accusative singular form of the name Duiciacus. So far we have Caesar orders Duiciacus. Then, just like in English, the verb order is often followed by an infinitive. So you order someone to do something, or you order something to be done. So here, it is followed by a passive infinitive, vocari. Caesar orders Duiciacus to be called. And finally, we have a prepositional phrase, ad se, that utilizes the reflexive pronoun that we learned about in this lesson. So remember, se reflects back to the subject, so we know it's referring to Caesar. So we could translate it as to him or to himself, and the whole sentence would read, Caesar orders Duiciacus to be called to him, or to be called to himself. And the one thing to keep in mind here is that it's unclear in English who the him is referring to, but in Latin we know it's referring to Caesar because it's reflexive, and reflexive pronouns always refer back to the subject of the sentence. Next we have number 2. Allobroges fuga se ad Caesarem recipiunt. So the allobroges are our subject, that's a group of people. Our verb is recipiunt, but remember that in our vocabulary, it clarified that recipiunt or recipio means something different when it's paired with the reflexive pronoun, and we see the reflexive pronoun se earlier in the sentence. So se recipio means to retreat. So altogether so far we have the allobroges retreat, because recipiunt is present active. So the allobroges retreat or are retreating. Ad Caesarem is a prepositional phrase that we would translate as to Caesar. So notice that Caesarem is the accusative singular form of Caesar because ad takes an accusative. And finally, we have the ablative singular noun fuga. So we might translate that as in flight or by means of flight. It's probably an ablative of means. So altogether, the allobroges retreat to Caesar in flight or by means of flight. And when I say flight here, I mean fleeing, like they're running away, not like they are flying. Number 3 reads, Helvetii sese allobrogibus vel persuasuros vel coacturos existimabant. So our subject is Helvetii. That is the nominative plural form of the word for the Helvetians, a group of people. And our main verb is existimabant. If you look back at our vocabulary, you will remember that this is one of our new words for this lesson. So existimo means to believe or to think or to estimate. So we can translate it as believe. Here, so far, we have the Helvetians were believing because existimabant is imperfect. And in Latin, usually a verb like believe or think is followed by an indirect statement. So we can expect something like the Helvetians were believing that. And indeed, if you look down to the footnotes, it tells us to supply esse, which is often omitted. So there is our infinitive verb in an indirect statement. So you'll notice that sometimes there is an indirect statement even if you can't find the infinitive, because sometimes the infinitive is implied. So the Helvetians were believing that, and then our subject is say. So remember that the subject of an indirect statement is accusative. So say is that intensive form of say, our reflexive pronoun, referring back to the subject. So the Helvetians were believing something about themselves. The Helvetians were believing that they are, and that's the implied essay. And then we have well and well. So when we have two wells in a sentence, we can translate them as either or. So the Helvetians were believing that they either are persuasuros or coacturos. And these are both future active participles. So with the infinitive altogether, they're really future active infinitives. You'll notice that these are the fourth principal parts, persuasum and coactum, but instead of the us or a or um ending, it's ur plus an ending. So we could translate this as they were believing that they were about to persuade or that they will persuade. That's persuasuros. And then coacturos comes from the verb cogere, which means to compel. It can also mean to round up. Since I think the other verb in the sentence is persuade, compel makes sense in this context. So the Helvetians were thinking that they were about to persuade or about to compel. So well and well, either about to persuade or about to compel. And since the verb persuadere takes a dative, we have the direct object, quote unquote, direct object, in the dative case here, even though cogere doesn't take the dative, because we only have the one direct object here, and that's allabrogibus. So the Helvetians were thinking that they either were about to persuade the allobroges or about to compel the allobroges. And another thing to point out about endings in this sentence is that the ending of persuasuros and coacturos are both accusative plural because they agree with say, because they are agreeing with the subject in an indirect statement. And remember, the subject of indirect statements are accusative. Number 4 is next. Frumentum omne praeterquam id quod secum portaturi errant comburunt. So if you look through this sentence, our main verb appears to be comburunt, which comes from a new verb we learned this lesson, which means to burn up or consume. And the ending nt tells us the subject is plural. And we don't have another plural nominative word in this sentence, so we can just translate this as they. They burn up. And our direct object is our first two words, which are accusative, singular, frumentum omne. Omne means all, and frumentum means grain. So far we have they burn up all the grain. And then we have a second part of the sentence set off in commas, starting with praeterquam, which is another word we learned this lesson that means except or besides. So they burn up all the grain except, and then id quod is a pretty common phrase that means that which. So we're talking about the grain here, except the grain which, or except that which. And then our verb in this clause is portaturi errant. That is a future active participle along with a verb to be. Errant is an imperfect form of essay, so we can translate it as they were. So except that which, or except the grain which they were. And it doesn't really make any sense without portaturi. That is our future active participle, and we can translate that as about to carry. So it's a participle because it's describing the subject, it's describing they, and we know it's describing the subject because it ends with I, which is a nominative plural masculine ending. Now, this is a little bit of a clunky way to say this. I think it would be a little clearer to just say this in the future tense, but what they've done here is instead of saying the grain which they will carry, they say the grain which they are about to carry. And then we have the word secum, which is another way of saying cum se, with them. So remember, se is a reflexive pronoun. It refers back to the subject. And in this case, we don't know exactly who the subject is. It's they. If you were reading this in context, you would know that the they is the Helvetians. They are gathering up their grain and burning what they can't take with them. So they burn up all the grain except that which they were about to carry with them. And them is referring to the subject of the sentence, they. Number 5 is next. Orgetorix se suis copiis suoque exercitu regna conciliaturum confirmat. Our subject is Orgetorix. That is a name, and it's the nominative form of that name, so we know it's the subject. And our main verb is confirmat, and our footnote tells us what that means. It means declares. So far, Orgetorix declares. And again, declares is the kind of verb that is often followed by an indirect statement. So our next word is say. Say, that reflexive pronoun referring back to Orgetorix, is accusative, and that's going to be the subject of our indirect statement. So Orgetorix declares that he, and then once again, we do not have a verb in the infinitive to be the verb of our indirect statement, but conciliaturum is a future active participle, and it has that little footnote again that we should supply esse. So we are implying that esse, be, is our verb in the indirect statement. So Orgetorix declares that he is, and then he is what? He is conciliaturum. That is a future active participle. You'll notice it's the fourth principal part with urum instead of just at the end. So we would translate that as about to verb. And conciliaturum comes from the verb that means to unite. So Orgetorix declares that he is about to unite. And then our direct object is regna. That's the accusative plural form of the neuter noun regnum, which means kingdom. So he declares that he is about to unite the kingdoms. And then he explains how he is going to do that. He is going to do that with two ablative phrases, suis copiis and suo exercitu. So he is going to unite the kingdoms with his own troops. That's suis copiis. Suis is that reflexive adjective, again referring back to the subject, but it's describing troops. So with his own troops and with his own exercitu, his own army. And the que at the end of suo is that enclitic that means and. So altogether we have Orgetorix declares that he is about to unite the kingdoms with his own troops and with his own army. Number 6 is next. Helvetii se angustos fines habere dicunt. Our subject is Helvetii. Again, that is the nominative plural form of the Helvetians, this tribe of Gallic people. So the Helvetians, and our main verb is dikunt. That is the third person plural form of dicere, which means to say. So the Helvetians say, and once again, dikunt is what we call a head verb, a verb that introduces an indirect statement. So they say that, and then our subject of the indirect statement, we need to find an accusative word. Now, almost all the rest of the words in this sentence are accusative, so it might be a little tricky figuring out which one is the subject. But if we look at the verb in the indirect statement, which is habere, it only makes sense for say to have rather than finis or angustos. So say is our reflexive pronoun that reflects back to the subject of the sentence, the Helvetians. So the Helvetians say that they, or maybe that they themselves, habere, they have. And the other two accusative words in the indirect statement are the direct objects. So what do the Helvetians have? They have narrow borders. So angustos is narrow and finis is borders. So altogether, the Helvetians say that they have narrow borders. Number 7 is next. Helvetii suis finibus eos prohibent. Our subject is the Helvetians again, that nominative plural form of Helvetii, and our verb is prohibent. That is third person plural, so we know that our subject is plural. There are a couple different ways we could translate prohibent. We could translate it as prohibit or hinder or forbid or prevent. I think almost all of those make almost enough sense for this sentence. The next word we should look at is eos. That's our direct object. Who are the Helvetians prohibiting or forbidding? They are forbidding them. Now, eos is a form of is, ea, id, so we can translate it as he, she, it, they. And here, it's plural, so we translate it as them. But in Latin, it is clear that it is someone else and not the Helvetians, because if it was referring to the Helvetians, it would be reflexive, referring back to the subject, and it is not reflexive. So the Helvetians forbid or prevent them, as in someone else. And then we have an ablative of separation, suis finibus, that we would translate as from their own borders. And suis is reflexive, so that is referring back to the Helvetians, the subject. So the Helvetians are prohibiting someone else, that's the them, and then from their, that is the Helvetians' borders. So the clearest way we might translate this is the Helvetians prohibit them from their own borders. Keeping in mind that English just doesn't have as clear pronouns as Latin does for this kind of sentence. Number 8 is next. Helvetii ad eas res conficiendas biennium sibi satis esse duxerunt. Once again, the subject is the Helvetians. Our main verb is duxerunt, which is a perfect form of the verb ducere, which means to lead. So you would think that this said the Helvetians led, but our footnote tells us that duco sometimes means to think. Maybe they're leading it along in their minds, if that helps you remember. So we can translate this as the Helvetians thought, and what follows is an indirect statement. And here, the infinitive, that is the verb in the indirect statement, is included. So the esse is not implied, it's actually in the sentence. So the Helvetians thought that something is. That's our verb in the indirect statement. The subject of the indirect statement is biennium. That is accusative singular, and the subject of an indirect statement is accusative. And biennium is one of our new words for this lesson. It means 2 years. So the Helvetians thought that 2 years are, that's esse, and then satis sibi. Satis means enough, and then often following the word enough is a dative word, enough for somebody. Sibi is the dative form of that reflexive pronoun. So the Helvetians thought that 2 years were enough for them being the Helvetians, because it's referring back to the subject. And then we have the phrase ad eos res conficiendas. So we have an odd and a gerundive, that's conficiendas. And whenever we have ad plus the gerundive, that is going to imply purpose. So it is enough for them to do what? 2 years is enough to complete. So conficere means to complete. And then eos res. Eos is a pronoun that sometimes can be translated as the same as hic, haec, hoc. So this or these. And then res is things. So conficiendas, remember, is a gerundive. So literally it should be future passive. It is enough for them for these things to be completed. But that sounds a little awkward in English. So what we often do with gerundives, especially in sentences like these, is we translate them active, even though literally they're passive. So altogether, we would say the Helvetians thought that 2 years was enough for them to do these things or to complete these things. I translated esse as was because whenever we have a present tense infinitive in indirect statement, we want to translate it with the same sense of time that the main verb had. So since duxerunt is in the past tense, it's perfect. We also want to translate esse with a past connotation. So they thought that they were. Number 9 is next. Orgeterix sibi legationem ad civitates suscepit. Orgeterix is the subject, and our main verb is suscepit, which is one of the new words we have for this lesson, which means to take up, but with sibi it means to take upon oneself or to undertake. And indeed, there is the word sibi earlier in this sentence, so we should translate suscipit sibi as to undertake. So Orgeterix undertook, because it's perfect tense. And what did he undertake? Our direct object is legationem, that's accusative singular, so we know it's the direct object. So Orgeterix undertook a legate, or perhaps embassy or delegation. And then ad civitates is a prepositional phrase that means to the city-states. And civitates is accusative because ad takes the accusative. So altogether we have Orgeterix undertook, or maybe took upon himself, the embassy to the city-states. The idea here is that Orgeterix is opening diplomatic channels with the Helvetians. Number 10 is next. Is suae civitatis imperium obtenturus erat. Our subject is is. That is a masculine singular form of the pronoun is ea id, so it translates quite literally to he. Our verb is a future active participle along with a form of to be. So obtenturus is our future active participle, and erat is the imperfect form of to be. Obtenturus comes from the verb obtenere, which means to get a hold of, to maintain, to obtain, any of those. So he was, that's erat, was about to obtain, obtenturus. And then what was he about to obtain? The direct object, the accusative word, imperium. We can translate that as power. And the rest of the sentence is a genitive phrase, sui civitatis. So literally that means the power of his own city-state. So sui is that reflexive adjective referring back to he, the subject, and civitatis means city-state. But that sounds a little awkward in English, so we might translate that genitive phrase instead of with the word of, with the word over instead. So he was about to obtain power over his own city-state. Keeping in mind that the phrase over his own city-state is genitive in Latin. Number 11 is next. Galli inter se differunt. Galli is the subject, and that is the nominative plural form of the word that means the Gallic people, or the Gauls. And then differunt is third person plural, present active indicative. It just means to differ or to be different. So the Gauls differ, and then inter se is a prepositional phrase. Inter means between or among, and then se is a reflexive pronoun, so it refers back to the subject, back to the Gauls. So literally this sentence says something like, the Gauls differ between themselves. But our footnote tells us that we can translate inter se as from each other, which makes sense. They are differing among themselves, which means they are different between the different groups of Gauls, so they are different from each other. And last we have number 12. Dum norix perficit uti obsides inter sese dent. Our subject is dum norix. That's the nominative form of the name dum norix. And our main verb is perficit. We could translate this a couple different ways. It comes from the verb perficere, which means to complete or to finish or to accomplish. So dum norix did this or completes or accomplishes, and I'm going to imply some sort of this, right? We're talking about whatever he did before that we don't really know the context of in this standalone sentence. So dum norix completed this, and then uti is an alternative form of ut, so it introduces a purpose clause. Ut can do a couple other things, but in this sentence, ut is going to introduce a purpose clause with the subjunctive verb dent, and that is the present active subjunctive form of dare. So dum norix did or completed this so that they could give, that's dent, so that they might give or for the purpose of them giving. All of those are acceptable ways of translating a purpose clause. And then our direct object is obsides. That is the accusative plural form of the noun that means hostages. So dum norix does this or completes this so that they can give hostages. And then inter sese is similar to the prepositional phrase we saw in the last sentence, inter se. Se is just that intensive form of se, the accusative reflexive pronoun. So we could literally translate this as among themselves, but your book tells you to translate this as to each other. I think either of those makes sense in English. So dum norix completes this so that they could give hostages among themselves, or so that they could give hostages to each other. Both of those make sense in English. And that is the end of the translation exercises for this lesson. So that is the end of lesson 43. And thank you so much.